Good afternoon, it's Gary Sly in the Legacy of Handmade Objects. I'm back in the shop today. It's July the 22nd, 2024. I've completed all my travels and celebrated a birthday with my uncle and just had some nice time away. Was back in the shop most of last week and am here on a Monday again. Wanted to go back just a little bit to episode number 37, where I talked a little bit about the Renaissance and focus in on a specific type of stitching today, blackwork embroidery. Talk just a little bit about what I know about the history of it and even some of the work that it takes to create it. I've really been fascinated with the Renaissance lately and have found a number of good sources where I can read about the importance of stitching back then. And I think probably in a lot of ways what we have inherited today and what we use gets a lot of its oomph or emphasis from what was so very important during the Renaissance. Of course, you know, you always want to remember that this sort of stitching is an international project. Every culture has some type of embroidery or embellishment associated with it. Well, blackwork in particular has been one that I've been interested in because I like stitching geometric patterns, and it's been quite helpful to have some ideas from the blackwork area. Blackwork, as far as we can tell, gets its start in Spain, or specifically in the Spain that was dominated by the Moorish Empire, the Islamic influence that was present in Spain before 1492, when that empire was overthrown and Spain became a largely Catholic country again. The reason I think blackwork and the style that it brings works well with Islam is because when you talk about any sort of images in Islam, you're never going to see people or animals. You might see some plant imagery, but largely what you see in Moorish or Islamic work is geometric figures. And so the idea of taking thread and creating images using black thread comes largely from that influence. Now, as far as England, where it became quite popular, Catherine of Aragon, who was Henry VIII's first wife, is actually the one who brought it to England and made it very popular. I talked about how important the court was in Renaissance and how the fashions that were brought together in the king or the queen's court were often copied and used by everybody around just to curry favor with them. Catherine of Aragon was Henry VIII's first wife, and she brought the technique of blackwork with her from Spain. If you think about what it is, blackwork is most specifically using black threads. But if you use intricate black thread geometric patterns, it has a tendency to look like lace or something fancier. So a number of years ago, I tried a little project where I did some black work, and I've come to understand that there's an awful lot more to it now than I realized back then. Hans Holbein the Younger was the court painter for Henry VIII, and he often depicts Henry VIII and his wives and other members of the British royalty of that day with clothing that has backstitch in it, or I'm sorry, blackwork in it, which is a form of backstitch, of course. And as I think I mentioned in episode 37 and want to reiterate here, the finer and more intricate the clothing that the king and his court wore, the more prestige they had. So you can see at the beginning of my video today, I have a picture of Henry VIII. And then there's a close-up of some of the black work that was actually part of one of his wives' costumes, Jane Seymour. And it is showing black work that the painter Hans Holbein captured in his paintings. Now, what's significant about Holbein is he's really one of the first and one of the significant figures in the Renaissance who begins to paint people and figures very realistically. The word verisimilitude is one that was used to describe what he was trying to do. When you look at a painting by Hans Holbein of Henry VIII, for instance, you can actually see the folds in the fabric. You can see the individual stitches. And one of the stitches in Blackwork is actually called the Holbein stitch, because in almost every one of Hans Holbein's paintings from that period, you can see that stitch depicted. So Blackwork in its essence is the use of black thread, typically. A lot of time you use silk because silk makes it much finer and more intricate looking, but you can also use cotton fibers. Blackwork is also intended to look exactly the same on the front and the back. So what you want to attempt to do there is work out the pattern sequence as you're stitching, so that you go up in one circle, down in the next, and then you create a similar pattern by going backwards up through the blank and down through the one that you've already stitched. I'd probably have to actually demonstrate it for it to make perfect sense. But basically you're going out by skipping a row or a hole each way on the way out, and coming back by filling those in, and that would create a solid black line both on the front and on the back. Now that's a running Holbein stitch, and then as it gets more complicated, you look at other stitches that you typically do in cross stitch, especially in back stitch, and you figure out a way to make sure that you come back in the same direction, filling any blank holes without doubling up. I did a class a year or so back where we designed a napkin, and I just bought these simple little cloth napkins at Michael's or Joann's or something like that, and I designed a very small medallion. I really didn't do any other work. I just did a quick little medallion on the napkin so that we would have it as an example for my class. I won't say that my back is perfect, but you can see that other than the fact that it's doubled up in some places where I had to pass under to tie it off, my design is basically the same on the front and the back. Now obviously if you were a court stitcher in the 17th century and you were making King Henry VIII's doublet or sleeve or whatever it would be, you were going to make darn sure that your stitching was perfect on the front and the back. I didn't feel that I had that kind of stress when I was working on that pattern, so I did it. It's pretty easy to find if you go snooping around some patterns for Blackwork that'll help you get the hang of it, because you really do kind of have to think through where you're going and how you're going to get back to where you started in order not to double up your threads or create or lose that illusion of the same on the front and back. I looked around the shop just briefly this morning, and I did have one pattern. This is a pretty old one by Lynn Skinner, and it actually gives you the instructions, and it actually has a stencil in it too that you can use to create on your fabric. I have mentioned this book before, but when I think about something like Blackwork, this old Reader's Digest guide to needlework is a great resource. Starting on page 57, they go through and talk a little bit about the history of Blackwork. They give you an example of some of the major stitches that you would use, in addition to just plain old back stitch and the Holbein stitch, which I mentioned. You can also do the same effect when you're using the darning stitch, when you're doing a double cross, even when you're doing an eyelet like the Algerian eye and some of the others. The nice thing about this Reader's Digest book is that they've dedicated, 8 pages just to Blackwork. So you've got some examples, you can see some patterns there. If you want to try it out and just play around with it, this is one of those resources. This is not in print anymore, but I have found them pretty easy to come across. I've got an extra one here in the shop right now, and it has just about everything you're ever going to need to figure out about fiber and fabric. I like Blackwork as part of what I do in terms of stitching, because it's a great way also to fill in an area. And if I'm not worried about the back, I probably won't take too much time to stress that. But when you look at this pomegranate, you can see the geometric patterns on the inside are also done with Blackwork. The strictest definition of Blackwork is that the back needs to look exactly like the front, but a more lenient version of that, if you're a stitcher and want to play with it a little bit and want to fill in some areas, is that you just use a thin black thread, either silk or cotton, probably only one ply, maybe two if you decide you want it to look a little stronger. You can also vary the number of strands to do shading when you're doing Blackwork. So if you did 3 strands, for instance, for an outline of something like the pomegranate, and then you did some of the geometric patterns, ovals, stars, whatever you want to do in the middle, you might use lesser strands. The more strands you use, the darker the Blackwork is, obviously. The fewer strands, the more delicate you can make your designs, and then you can have light and dark areas. I have mentioned a number of times that I'm part of the Embroiderers Guild of America. I have been, over the last few years, involved in becoming a master craftsman in counted thread embroidery, which is counted cross stitch. The second project, which I have largely designed but haven't started stitching yet, involves Blackwork, in that you have to do a border using the Holbein stitch, and you have to design that yourself. And what I've done, I found a wonderful pattern on a mosque when I was in India, and I have adapted that design to create what I hope will be a border using the Holbein stitch. And then in the middle of that project, we have to show that we're adapting the Assisi stitch, or Assisi stitching, which I might talk about in another episode. The basic idea of Assisi is that you stitch the background and you leave your white or open spaces for the object that you're stitching. Look it up if you're interested. And of course, Assisi, as you might guess, comes from Italy, probably from that wonderful little town of Assisi, which, if you're ever in Tuscany and don't go to Assisi, you're missing an opportunity. The church there dedicated to Francis of Assisi is stupendous. It's a city basically built up on a plateau, and it's rather hard to get there. You have to go up a bus or some sort of vehicle, but it's just a lovely place. And whenever I think about that Assisi stitch, I think about my time there. I guess one thing I failed to mention, when you're working on Blackwork, and when you're trying to make it exactly the same on the front and the back, you will want to learn to start out by using a waist knot. And let me just hold this up to give you an example. If I were going to start, let's say, with this line here, the one that's going across horizontally, I would go a couple inches away up here somewhere, and I would bring my needle through and back down and create a little knot there so that it would hold in place. And then I would go behind and begin my Holbein stitch by going up one square, down another square, all the way across, and then come back and finish off. And that would allow me to start and to pass underneath at the end. But then I could cut that waist knot and take the beginning stitch and also pass that through, so that when you look at it from the back, all you'd be seeing are the horizontal and the vertical rows of stitches. And if you pass through effectively, which I can't say I did too well there, that would not show very much either. I should have done this with a finer thread, and then you probably would not have been able to see that. So check out a waist knot too, because that's another good way of integrating the fineness and the delicacy of blackwork. So hopefully you learned a little bit of history about stitching, and you have an idea of a new technique that you might want to explore. I mentioned the Algerian eye stitch. I love stitching eyelets that create a little hole in the middle, and you'll see those a lot in samplers. So maybe we should take an episode and look at eyelets and eye stitches as well. But that pretty much takes up my time for today. I hope you'll take what I've offered and maybe go forward and look a little bit more and create some ideas of your own that integrate the technique of blackwork. As always, this is Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects. Good day.